Story 1. Back in the late summer of 2009, I was working on a tugboat that was helping an oil tanker off the coast of Louisiana. There had been storms recently and the sea was still rough, and while our tug wasn't really in danger, the tanker definitely was. It was huge, heavy, and valuable, and the waves were slamming into it hard, so our job was to help keep it steady. I had always loved the water, and honestly, I still do, but on the morning of August 17th, while we were guiding that tanker along the coast, something happened that tested that love in the worst way possible. I was in the bathroom when it happened, which is probably the worst place you can be when a freak wave hits. I'd only been awake for maybe 10 or 15 minutes. Everything felt normal, quiet even, and then, without any warning at all, the entire world flipped. 1 second, the toilet was beneath my feet, and the next second it was above my head. I slammed into the wall as the lights cut out, and I could hear water rushing in. It was filling the bathroom fast. My eyes burned, and I couldn't tell if the sting was from seawater or blood. I managed to get the bathroom door open, but there was no time to feel relieved, because I felt this heavy, sickening thud as the tugboat hit the seabed, at least 100 feet below the surface. When the door finally opened, everything was pitch black. Water was everywhere, pouring through the ship, and I had no idea which direction was up or down. The propeller was above us, the wheelhouse was below, and near the watertight door that led to an exit hatch, I saw two of my coworkers desperately struggling with it as the water kept rising. Panic took over. I was sure that if they couldn't get that door open, we were all going to drown. Acting completely against my instincts, I dove into the water, hoping there might be another way out. Most people have never been inside a sinking ship, but when a vessel goes down and fills with water, it doesn't flood evenly. The water moves in strange, unpredictable ways. It's like pouring water into an ant farm, where some tunnels fill instantly and others trap pockets of air. That's how I got swept into a second bathroom, one connected to the second engineer's cabin. The door slammed shut behind me, and somehow it created one of those air pockets. At first, the water kept rising, and I was sure I was going to be trapped and drowned, but then it stopped. It only filled about 1/3 of the bathroom and went no higher. The reason it didn't fully flood was because we always kept the cabin doors closed. It was mainly for security, but it also slowed flooding. That habit saved my life. I clung to the wash basin, standing in my own small bubble of air at the bottom of the gulf. In the darkness, I could hear my coworkers screaming and shouting. I couldn't understand what they were saying, but I thought maybe they had opened the hatch. Believing that, I tried to swim back to them. When I grabbed the bathroom door handle and pulled, it snapped right off in my hand. The panic came back instantly, stronger than before. It felt so intense that I thought my mind might just break. Then, just as suddenly, it stopped. A strange calm washed over me. Everything before had been chaos and terror, but after that handle broke, it felt like I finally understood the situation. I knew where I was. I knew what I had to do. There was only one option: solve the problem or die trying. Thinking that way, as strange as it sounds, brought me peace. It was just me and that door. Whatever happened next could wait. I spotted a vent and thought that if I could pull the steel grill off, I might use it as a tool. Somehow, it was strong enough to help me pry the bathroom door open, but it took a long time and a lot of effort. While I struggled, the screams of my coworkers went silent one by one. At the time, I thought they had escaped. I know now that they hadn't. Once the door finally opened, I was back in the second engineer's cabin. I found 2 life jackets, each with a small flashlight attached. I bit down on one and stuffed the other into the elastic of my underwear. Then I tried to swim toward the escape hatch outside the cabin. Every corridor was completely flooded, with no air pockets at all. Each time I ran out of breath, I had to turn back and swim to the engineer's cabin to breathe before trying again. The first time I swam back, I almost missed the cabin door. In the darkness, every door looked the same. I knew that if I got turned around, I would drown. Later, I learned that the same thing happened to a coworker who drowned in the mess room after mistaking it for a place with air. To keep myself from getting lost, I tore fabric from the engineer's coveralls, tied it into a rope, and secured one end to the cabin door so I could follow it back every time I needed air. I tried again and again, but the hatch would not move. Eventually, I realized I was wasting energy. I decided to stay in my small air pocket and think. Hours passed. I ate canned sardines and drank soda just to keep my strength up. I kept my legs out of the water because I had scraped my skin during one of my escape attempts. At first, I thought the stinging was just salt water, but then I realized it was small crayfish swimming up and picking at the peeling skin. I thought the water level would stay the same, but after a while, I noticed it creeping slowly higher up the wall. That's when I accepted that I was probably going to die. I thought about my family, and strangely, it brought me peace. I imagined them going on without me. My kids would grow up without their father, but between company compensation and life insurance, they would at least be taken care of. Thinking that way was the only comfort I had as I sat in total silence, conserving oxygen, waiting for the end. Then the silence was broken by a loud metallic clunk, metal on metal. I couldn't see anything outside the ship, but I knew there was a chance someone was out there. I didn't scream because that would waste oxygen. Instead, I started pounding my fist against the bulkhead. Minutes later, a light appeared through a porthole. Divers were outside. I took a deep breath and dove back into the water, searching for a porthole where they could see me. I moved from room to room, forcing doors open, then rushing back to my air pocket for another breath. Over and over again. Finally, I saw the divers. I pressed my hand against the glass. One of them later told me he thought I was just another body at first. When I started banging, they realized I was alive. They didn't bring me straight to the surface. You can't do that after being that deep for so long. The pressure change could kill you. I spent a long time in a diving bell, breathing from a spare oxygen tank before I was allowed to resurface. The divers told me I'd been down there for almost 14 hours. It felt like maybe 3. Coming up into the night instead of daylight made it feel like I had jumped through time. Medics checked me over and told me to go to the hospital, but all I wanted was to see my wife and kids. Against advice, I went home and hugged them harder than I ever had. For a long time after, I had terrible nightmares. Sometimes it felt like my bed was sinking. Other times, water poured in through the windows. My wife was unconscious, and the door wouldn't open as the water kept rising until I woke up. Friends suggested a vacation somewhere far from water, and it helped. I avoided pools at first, then slowly forced myself to face it. Knowing I was safe made the difference. And like I said at the start, I've always loved the water story too. When I was 14 years old, my family and I went on a boating trip out of Melbourne's Western Port Bay. I remember standing at the helm with my father, watching him steer the small boat as it bounced over the waves. Everything felt calm, almost peaceful, and then, without warning, my big brother started shouting that water was coming in. From that moment on, everything moved too fast to understand. Mom and Dad were yelling for us to stay together, voices sharp with fear, and then suddenly the boat tipped and we were thrown into the water. Later we learned that the bottom of the boat had been almost completely rotten, and that the people who rented it to us had been extremely and willfully negligent. At the time, none of that mattered. The boat was gone, sinking beneath us, and we had no choice but to start swimming. It was late in the evening, and no one had seen us go down, which meant no one was coming to save us. We had to rescue ourselves. I was a reasonably good swimmer, and we all had life jackets, but shore was still about 2 miles away, and it looked impossibly far. As we swam, darkness slowly fell around us. The water felt colder by the minute. My dad began to struggle, and my big brother turned back to help him. My mom and I stayed together and kept moving forward, but before long, we lost sight of both my father and my brother. Seagulls cried above me, and every sound made my stomach twist. I kept imagining they were warning me, calling out about sharks that had to be circling beneath the surface. I could see land, but it never seemed to get any closer, no matter how long I swam. After more than 3 hours in the water, my feet finally touched something solid. I felt the sandy bottom beneath me and realized I had reached the mud flats of what I thought was the mainland. Relief hit me for just a second, then fear came rushing back. My mom, dad, and brother were nowhere to be seen. I was weak, freezing, and completely exhausted. I dragged myself forward through thick mud that sometimes reached up to my waist. In some ways, this was even more terrifying than the open water. The mud pulled at me, sucking me down, and I was terrified I'd sink and suffocate right there. My muscles ached, my lungs burned, and I felt like I might pass out at any moment. Still, I knew I couldn't stop. The clock was ticking in my head, loud and constant. It felt like everything depended on me alone. If I didn't get help, my family would die. That thought pushed me forward step by painful step. When I finally reached dry shore, I realized I wasn't on the mainland at all. I was on French Island, a place with an old, disused prison, and only about 50 people living there. I ran through the bush using the very last of my energy. Thorns tore at my legs and arms, scratching and cutting my skin as I pushed through the darkness. I ran until my chest hurt, stopping only to gasp for air before forcing myself forward again. After what felt like forever, I found a house. I banged on the door until someone answered, and when they did, everything poured out of me. I told them what had happened, and I remember crying uncontrollably as they tried to comfort me. I begged them to help find my family. They told me everything would be okay and that they had contacted the Victoria Coast Guard. I know they were trying to be kind, but deep down, I knew they were wrong. The next morning, the bodies of my mom, dad, and older brother were recovered from the water off the coast of Fairhaven. There are no words that can fully explain how devastated I was. I was crushed by overwhelming survivor's guilt, constantly thinking that I should have been the one who died. For 5 long years, I was a complete wreck. I honestly believe I would be dead from drink and drugs if it hadn't been for the birth of my first child. For a very long time, I avoided any large body of water, even swimming pools. Eventually, my therapist suggested exposure therapy. It started with short visits to a local pool, but my anxiety was so bad that even with my head above water, I felt like I couldn't breathe. I tried for 4 months, and nothing seemed to help. Then a local swim coach heard my story and offered to help. Slowly, over the next year or so, the fear began to loosen its grip. Piece by piece, the therapy chipped away at it. Eventually, I was able to look at the sea without feeling like I was about to have a panic attack. One of my proudest moments was taking part in a charity swim across the Rip, an infamously rough stretch of water. We raised money for a domestic violence charity here in Australia, a cause that's very close to my heart for reasons that could easily be another true scary story. It may have taken me 20 years, but I no longer let fear control me. I now understand that what happened wasn't my fault, but the irony of needing water to heal the very trauma that it created has never been lost on me. Story threw me back in late August of 1985. My fiancé and I set out on a 3-week sailing trip. Our job was to sail a 44-ton yacht named Tamaru from French Polynesia to San Francisco, and we were being paid very well to do it. Between the two of us, we had years of sailing experience, but the 4,000-mile journey was the longest either of us had ever attempted. We were confident we could handle it. Still, early on, there was a worrying change in the weather forecast that made us uneasy. Statistically, hurricanes in the South Pacific usually arrived very late in the season, closer to mid or late October. By leaving in late August, we believed we were safely ahead of the worst weather. That was the plan, at least, but as the saying goes, man proposes and God disposes. 3 weeks into our voyage, we found ourselves staring down a Category 4 hurricane. The waves towered above us as tall as 20-story buildings. We had sailed through gales and storms before, but nothing even close to a hurricane. For 3 days we tried to outrun it, but our boat could only manage about 15 miles per hour. Eventually, the storm caught up with us. Once it did, there was no turning back. Escape was no longer possible. We had no choice but to face it head on. We pulled on raincoats and boarded up the yacht while 140 mile-per-hour winds and 40-foot waves slammed into us. The rain and wind felt like BB pellets tearing into our skin. It was violent, relentless, and unlike anything we had ever experienced. Still, we believed we could survive it if we could just wait it out. At one point, I went below deck to grab something. Suddenly, I heard my fiancé shout, "Oh my God!" The yacht was hit by a massive wave. I was thrown off my feet, and the last thing I remember was my head smashing into something hard. Then everything went fuzzy. I think I was unconscious for a minute or two. When I came to, blood was running down my face and soaking my raincoat. I was lying on the floor, disoriented and terrified. I couldn't hear my fiancé, so I forced myself back on deck to look for him. The last time I had seen him, he was strapping himself into his safety harness. When I reached the deck, the harness was still there, but it was empty. He was gone. I screamed his name into the storm, but the wind swallowed my voice. I knew I had to pull myself together. There would be time to grieve later. If I didn't focus on surviving, people would soon be mourning me too. It was clear the yacht had suffered devastating damage. The navigation system, engine, and sails were either soaked beyond repair or completely shredded. Even worse, the hull was taking on water at an alarming rate. My instincts took over. I started pumping water out of the cabin as fast as I could. Using the storm jib and a broken pole, I managed to rig an improvised sail. The only tools I had left were a sextant and a watch, but with my experience, it was enough to point me toward land. For 41 days, I drifted alone across the Pacific, carefully rationing canned food and water. Each day blurred into the next, filled with exhaustion, fear, and silence. Then one day, I finally saw land. It was the Hawaiian island of Hilo. As I drifted toward the harbor, a Japanese ship spotted me and rescued me. For weeks afterward, I slept with one of my fiancé's old shirts wrapped around my pillow. His scent was the only thing that brought me comfort. I pushed the pain and grief deep into my mind just to survive. But once I was safe, it all came crashing out of me like water through a broken dam. It took many years before I could sail again. Even now, I'm far more cautious about the jobs I take. I thought about quitting sailing entirely, but eventually I realized it's where I belong. And if there's one small silver lining to the dark, heavy cloud of my fiancé's tragic death, it's that he went out doing what he loved most. Story 4 On April 17th of 1918, the SS Doomer Rue set sail from Portland, Oregon, bound for the South Pacific. Owned by the U.S. Shipping Board, the 270-foot 500-ton wooden steamer was meant to carry goods between the United States and the many Philippine islands, nearly 70 miles to the west. Its builders, the Grant Smith Porter Ship Company, had great hopes for their creation, but almost immediately there were dark signs that worried those who knew ships best. When the vessel was launched in Portland during the spring of 1918, it lurched into the water and smashed into several houseboats along the Willamette River. The ship's captain, a tough Scandinavian man named Ola Beronson, brushed off the fears of his nervous crew. He dismissed the incident as bad luck and ordered the ship onward to San Francisco. During the calmer days of late summer, the Doomer Rue finally departed the United States in September of 1918. She stopped in Hawaii, then sailed on to Guam. On October 16th, the ship left Guam's Apra Harbor, bound for the Philippine capital of Manila. Only then was the ship loaded with its final cargo, a horrifying combination of several thousand gallons of gasoline and a massive shipment of trinitrotoluene, better known as TNT. As the Doomer Rue pulled away from the harbor, heavy storm clouds gathered along the horizon. Before long, the storm broke with full force. The ship crashed through the roaring waves of the Philippine Sea, her crew fighting desperately to keep her afloat. Then, without warning, disaster struck. A bolt of lightning tore through the sky and slammed into the wooden deck of the Doomer Rue, triggering a deadly chain reaction that ignited the gasoline and the crates of dynamite. Survivor Thien Bean later said that the front of the ship simply exploded into flames after a blinding white flash. Almost immediately, the order was given to abandon ship. The crew rushed to the 3 life vessels, which consisted of 2 boats and a small raft. In their panic, the men failed to spread themselves evenly. One lifeboat pulled away with only 9 men aboard and 11 empty seats, while another became dangerously overloaded with more than 30 terrified sailors clinging to it. Soon after, rough seas separated the 3 vessels completely. On October 26th of 1918, the Sunday Oregonian reported that Captain Beronson, his second mate, and 3 crew members had been found alive. They had been picked up by a transport ship just 9 days after the Doomaroo exploded. Their fight for survival was over. The rest of the crew was not so lucky. Thean Bean, who found himself packed into the lifeboat holding 32 men, later described how they drifted through the night until sunrise revealed Guam on the horizon. Hope surged through them, but it didn't last. A sudden shift in wind and currents sent their boat drifting away from land and back into the open Philippine Sea. Their spirits were lifted again when a passing steamer appeared. They rowed frantically, shouting and waving, but the ship sailed past without ever noticing them. For days afterward, the sailors prayed for favorable winds, but as time passed, their situation grew desperate. Their rations were reduced to 2 tablespoons of water a day and a single piece of hardtack. After 7 days adrift, they were too weak to row. Around 2 weeks into the ordeal, the first men began dying from exposure. 3 days later, the hardtack ran out. Not a single drop of rain had fallen. Some men, driven mad by thirst, drank seawater. Every one of them died in agony within hours. A few of the more resourceful sailors tried to build a crude evaporator using shoes, oars, and scraps of wood chipped from the boat to fuel a small fire. It was clever, but useless. Finally, the survivors made a decision born of pure desperation. After a tense and angry discussion, one starving sailor took a rubber hose from a bilge pump and turned it into a fishing line. Using a knife, he cut flesh from the bodies of dead shipmates and tied it to the line as bait. Eventually, dolphins swam near the boat. Lured closer by the taste of human flesh, one was speared, killed, and butchered. Thean Bean later wrote that the meat and moisture from the dolphin were welcomed, but he barely spoke of how it was obtained. On the 24th day, land finally appeared. Weak cheers rose from the boat as hope returned for the first time in weeks. But the nightmare was not over. As the lifeboat neared white tropical sands, rough waves flipped it over. The survivors were thrown onto a seabed covered in jagged coral, ripping open their sunburned skin. Some men were too weak to swim and drowned among the coral, dying just short of safety. Of the 32 men who entered the lifeboat, only 14 survived. Those who returned were treated as minor heroes, praised by the media for their strength and determination. The dead were honored as brave Americans. Thean Bean claimed that fallen comrades were given proper burials at sea, but the truth was far darker. Nearly 12 years later, on January 1st, 1930, a man named L.E.L. Thomas published a book titled ***The Wreck of the Doomaroo**, revealing shocking details of cannibalism. The book caused public outrage. A reporter from the New York Times investigated and discovered Thomas's source was real. The ship's assistant engineer, Fred Harmon. His account matched the official U.S. Navy report. According to naval records, 4 survivors died on the 18th day. 1, the chief engineer, allowed his flesh to be eaten after death. The meat was boiled in a kerosene can. Harmon said it tasted good, but eating more the next day made everyone sick and unstable. Harmon claimed the idea came from a Greek sailor named George, who threatened violence if they refused. Under orders from the first mate and watched by a lieutenant, flesh was prepared and passed around. Though horrified at first, the men believed it was the only way to live. They later consumed a Hawaiian mess boy who had grown too weak to move. After the book's release, the survivors admitted the cannibalism was real. Rumors persisted that some men chose to jump into the sea rather than be eaten. The details are almost impossible to comprehend, but perhaps the most chilling thought of all is that if the wind had shifted differently, or if one passing ship had noticed the lifeboat, this horrifying chapter of survival might have been averted entirely. Story 5. In October of the year 1725. A British trading ship known as the Luxborough Galley set sail from the coasts of southern England under the command of Captain William Calloway. The Luxborough was assigned to complete a triangular trade route for the South Sea Company, transporting cotton, slaves, and rum between Europe, Africa, and the Americas. In the years that followed, the vessel became tied to terrible misfortune. In one horrifying incident, more than 600 African slaves died after a smallpox outbreak swept through the ship, wiping out over a third of its human cargo. Many believed such a massive loss of life cursed the Luxborough, and whispers spread that the dead would one day seek revenge on those who sailed her. It took until June of 1727 for those dark fears to come true, but when they did, the outcome was devastating. After delivering a cargo of rum and sugar across the Atlantic, the Luxborough caught fire on the return journey, according to a 24-year-old second mate named William Boy, who had served in the Royal Navy since the age of 14. The fire began in a tragic and simple way. Two young cabin boys noticed liquid dripping down a wooden support beam. Fearing the hull was leaking, they grabbed a candle to see better. When they raised the flame, the liquid suddenly ignited. It wasn't seawater at all, but rum leaking from a poorly sealed barrel. Within moments, a violent explosion sent flames racing through the ship's hold. The crew fought desperately to control the fire, but it quickly became clear their efforts were useless. Fearing the ship's gunpowder stores would explode, some men fell to their knees and prayed for their souls. Others rushed for the only escape vessel, a small 16-ton yawl with 3 oars. In the chaos, the boat was overloaded with 22 men and boys, while 16 others were left behind. Some chose to stay with the ship, but many more suffocated while trying to reach a second lifeboat. The survivors rowed frantically, desperate to put distance between themselves and the burning ship. When the explosion finally came, it showered the sea with shattered wood and burned human remains. Those in the yawl survived the blast, but now faced a new nightmare. They were stranded in the middle of the Atlantic with no food, no fresh water, and no protection from the brutal summer sun. After 2 weeks drifting helplessly, the number of survivors dropped from 22 to just 12. It's believed more would have died if Newland fishermen hadn't spotted the drifting boat during a routine voyage. Sadly, Captain William Calloway died the day after the rescue, followed by 6 more crew members in the weeks that followed. Only 5 men from the Luxborough ever made it home. Though 2 of their names were lost to time, 3 remain recorded. William Boy, the second mate and 10-year naval veteran, lived to the age of 74. The ship's surgeon, Dr. Scrimshaw, died at 80. Most important to this story was a sailor named George Mould, who later died at Greenwich Hospital aged 82. One of Mould's doctors was Dr. William Boy Jr., the son of the second mate. He had grown up hearing his father's survival story and conducted detailed interviews with Mould. This made him one of the greatest authorities on the disaster, using what he learned from both men. Dr. Boy wrote an account in 1787. Newspapers across Britain and America published it, and readers were gripped by the tale of fire, survival, and desperation. People marveled at how the survivors created sails and collected fresh water. But one part of the story shocked the world more than any other: the events of the 5th day at sea. In his account, Dr. Boy wrote that birds flew overhead and fish swam near the boat. The men tried to catch them using hatbands tied together and a pin as a hook, baited with flesh from the dead. They caught nothing. Hunger grew, and they realized they needed real nourishment to survive. That was when they were driven to the unthinkable act of eating the bodies of their dead companions and drinking their blood. The surgeon, Dr. Scrimshaw, was the first to suggest it and ate the first piece himself. He wept as he did so, turning his face away in shame. The men tried different parts of 6 bodies, but could only stomach the hearts, eating 3. They drank blood from 4 bodies, collecting it shortly after death. The men showed deep respect for rank, refusing to drink until the captain, surgeon, and officers had taken their share. Though horrifying, this act kept them alive. They felt strengthened by the nourishment, unnatural as it was. Since most of the men who took part later died, no charges were ever brought. Even so, this episode remains one of the darkest chapters in British maritime history. Story 6. On May 19th of 1884, a yacht known as the Minion Net departed the English port of Southampton, bound for the distant coast of eastern Australia. Built back in 1867, the 52-ton cruiser had recently been purchased by an Australian lawyer named Jack W., who was searching for a crew willing to sail her all the way to Sydney. Finding men brave enough was far from easy. Many experienced sailors warned that the yacht was designed for coastal waters and was dangerously unfit for long journeys across the open ocean. On top of that, the terrifying 15,000-mile voyage scared even hardened seamen, and many refused the job outright. Eventually, after numerous rejections, a crew of just 4 men was assembled. They were Captain Tom Dudley, Edwin Stevens, Edmund Brooks, and a 17-year-old cabin boy named Richard Parker. Nearly 2 months into the journey, the crew of the Minion found themselves sailing into a violent gale roughly 1,600 miles northwest of the Cape of Good Hope in South Africa. Despite the brutal winds, the voyage was still moving forward steadily. Wanting to get some rest, Captain Dudley ordered the yacht to heave to. In sailing terms, this meant slowing the ship and fixing the sails and helm so no one had to steer, a common tactic used to ride out bad weather. Just as the maneuver was completed, young Richard Parker was sent below deck to prepare some tea. That was the moment disaster struck. A massive freak wave slammed into the yacht, smashing a bulkhead and allowing huge amounts of seawater to pour into the hold. It became instantly clear that the vessel was doomed. Captain Dudley quickly ordered the crew into their single 13-foot lifeboat. The boat itself was poorly made, with thin wooden boards barely a quarter-inch thick. But as the Minion began to tilt and groan, it was their only hope of survival. Minutes later, the 4 men watched in horror as the yacht slipped beneath the waves, leaving them alone on the open sea with almost nothing. They had managed to save only a few navigation tools and 2 small tins of turnips. At first, Captain Dudley was able to steady the lifeboat by creating an improvised sea anchor, something like an underwater parachute that dragged behind them and slowed their movement, making steering slightly easier. From his calculations, the captain realized they were still about 700 miles from the nearest land, meaning rescue was unlikely to come anytime soon. Their very first night at sea turned into a nightmare when a great white shark circled the lifeboat and had to be beaten away using nothing but their oars. The next morning brought a small victory when they managed to catch a sea turtle by dragging it up from the water. The turtle provided around 3 pounds of meat per man, and along with its bones and the tins of turnips, this food supply lasted until July 17th. The crew planned to drink the turtle's blood to prevent dehydration, but when it became contaminated with seawater, they were left with no choice but to drink their own urine. By July 20th, the young cabin boy Richard Parker had grown so desperate and sickened by this routine that he began gulping down seawater instead. This only made his condition worse. His dehydration became severe, and he soon collapsed into unconsciousness. Around this same time, Dudley, Stevens, and Brooks began quietly discussing the unthinkable possibility of cannibalism. On July 24th, Captain Dudley told the others that it would be better for 1 man to die so the others could live. He suggested drawing lots to decide. Brooks refused immediately. That night, Dudley raised the subject again, arguing that the cabin boy was likely already dying, while he and Stevens both had wives and children depending on them. Parker, he said, would be mourned, but his parents would not starve without his wages the way their families might. This cold reasoning seemed to change things. The next morning, Dudley and Stevens decided that killing Richard Parker before he died naturally would allow them to drink his blood while it was still fresh. Brooks later claimed he neither agreed nor objected. Captain Dudley said a prayer, and with Stevens holding the boy down in case he woke, Dudley pressed his penknife into Parker's jugular vein, ending his life. Once the boy's heart stopped, the 3 survivors began cutting up his body. Horribly, despite his earlier hesitation, Edmund Brooks was said to eat Parker's flesh eagerly, while Stevens barely touched it, clearly shaken. Captain Dudley later described the scene, saying he would never forget the sight of his companions over that dreadful meal, comparing them to mad wolves fighting over scraps, driven beyond reason. Just days later, while still feeding on Parker's remains, the survivors spotted a passing ship called the Monuma and managed to signal it. Finally, on September 6th of 1884, the Monuma arrived in Falmouth Harbor. The three men reported to a customs officer named Mr. Cheeseman. At first, they were met with relief, as everyone had assumed the Minion's crew was lost at sea. But once they explained exactly how they had survived, the mood changed instantly. Shockingly, the men were completely honest and openly admitted to killing Richard Parker and eating his flesh. While modern lawyers would be horrified by such a confession, Dudley and his crew believed they were protected by what was known as the custom of the sea. For centuries, sailors shipwrecked and cast adrift had faced the terrible question of whether to eat their dead or dying companions. Though rare, such acts were deeply embedded in maritime culture. Past cases showed that courts often showed mercy. Even as recently as 1874, crews had resorted to cannibalism after shipwrecks, and charges were quietly dropped. British naval influence ran deep in government, and sympathy for shipwreck survivors was strong. However, after telling their story, Dudley and Stevens found themselves detained and later charged. Public sympathy was divided. Brooks was eventually acquitted, but Dudley and Stevens were convicted and sentenced to death. Outrage followed, and after heavy pressure, their sentences were reduced to 6 months in prison. The case became famous, studied by law students even today, and echoed eerily in literature, including stories that seemed to predict the tragedy years before it happened. Perhaps this grim repetition shows that no matter the century, when humans are pushed beyond the edge by hunger and fear, the same dark choices return again and again. From wooden ships to whatever vessels may one day cross the stars, survivors may still face what was once called the delicate question. Hey friends, thanks for listening. Click that notification bell to be alerted of all future narrations. I release new videos every Monday and Thursday at 700 p.m. EST, and there are super fun live streams on Sundays and Wednesday nights. If you got a story, be sure to submit them to my subreddit r/letter official or over email, and you might even hear your story featured on the next video. And if you want to support me even more, grab early access to all future narrations and bonus content over on Patreon, or click that big join button to hear about the extra perks offered for members of the channel, and check out the Let's Read podcast, where you can hear all of these stories and big compilations located anywhere you listen to podcast. All links in description below. Thanks so much friends, and remember to always click it or tick it.